Wire the $5,000 allowance right now, or I will divorce you. The text illuminated the darkness of my Chicago hotel room. A second later, my phone buzzed again. Buster's smart feeder was offline. My husband had just unplugged it. He was holding my rescue dog hostage over a bank transfer. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I took a steady breath, forwarded his extortion threat to my attorney, and smiled at the screen. Mark thought he was triggering a negotiation. He had no idea he just activated his own financial execution. Have you ever realized the person you trusted most was silently setting a trap for you? Tell me where you're listening from. The silence in my hotel room is absolute, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain against the large glass windows. Any other wife might have immediately dialed her husband's number, weeping, demanding an explanation, or begging him to plug the dog feeder back in. I did none of those things. Instead, I opened the security application on my phone and accessed the hallway camera inside my Seattle penthouse. The high-definition footage loaded seamlessly. I watched Mark, dressed in a silk robe paid for by my corporate salary, forcefully yank the power cord of Buster's feeder from the wall socket. He looked smug, entirely convinced that this petty act of cruelty would force my hand. He truly believed that using an innocent rescue dog as leverage would make me open my banking application and wire him his monthly $5,000. What Mark did not know was that my trip to Chicago for this corporate strategy summit was not just a routine business obligation. It was a carefully orchestrated absence. I needed to be hundreds of miles away to see exactly how he would behave when he thought I was entirely powerless to stop him. He had always thrived on immediate confrontation. He fed on my anxiety and my desperate attempts to keep the peace. But yesterday, 24 hours before I boarded my flight, I had quietly logged into our shared portals and severed his access. I changed the master passwords to the main accounts. I removed his authorized user privileges on the primary credit lines. I even reset the PIN codes for the building's digital access logs. Watching him on that glowing screen, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The heavy fog of confusion and guilt that had clouded my mind for years simply evaporated. For so long, I had allowed him to dictate the terms of our reality, bending over backward to accommodate his volatile moods. I had paid for his lifestyle to avoid his endless verbal barrages, but seeing him disconnect a food bowl just to extort money from me severed the very last thread of empathy I held for him. I closed the security application and placed my phone face down on the nightstand. I did not need to negotiate with him ever again. His countdown had already begun. His timer had already started. To understand the sheer audacity of Mark's extortion, you have to understand the elaborate illusion he had constructed over the past 4 years. Mark introduced himself to the world as a visionary venture capitalist. He wore bespoke suits imported from Italy, carried business cards printed on heavy cardstock, and spoke in a constant stream of financial jargon. Whenever we attended elite charity galas or high-profile corporate dinners in Seattle, he would dominate the conversation. He would stand in the center of the room, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, telling aspiring entrepreneurs that he was always looking for the next big innovation to find. People admired him. They saw a confident, wealthy man who was shaping the future of technology. The reality behind closed doors was entirely different. Mark had never invested a single dime of his own money into any company. His personal bank accounts routinely hovered near zero. The bespoke suits, the luxury watches, the expensive dinners where he generously picked up the tab to impress strangers. Every single expense was funded directly by my paycheck as a corporate strategy director. I discovered the true depth of his delusion one evening when I borrowed his laptop to print a simple document. His email was open, He had sent a pitch
це
rejection to a
сделано.
young female founder seeking
Опять
capital for her
второй
startup.
стрим без закрепа
In the
вообще.
email, he wrote gracefully, "My wife handles the corporate strategy and the mundane operational details.
Как в
I
хат
handle the
надо,
capital
не
and the major
знаю.
equity allocations. Currently,
Научи
your
меня.
vision does not align with my portfolio." I remember staring at those words, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. He was not just living off
Так,
my income.
пин.
He was actively
Yes.
stealing my professional standing to build his fake empire. He would take
С
photographs
ноги.
of us at exclusive industry events, crop me entirely
Может,
out of
на
the
моей
frame,
жопе
and
сделаешь
post them on his
сиквел?
professional
Давай
networking profiles
сделаю.
with captions implying he was the keynote speaker. He was a
Готовь
parasite wrapped in
жопу,
cashmere, feeding on my
раздевайся,
credibility to elevate his own
поворачивайся.
fragile ego. He needed that $5,000 a month not just for spending money, but to maintain the heavy, expensive mask he wore in public.
Вечер радости,
Without my money,
сладость.
his entire
Мой дед
identity
не
would collapse
работает,
into
стримеру
dust.
похуй.
He
Что
sold
за
my shadow
дела?
as his,
А кто чё
sitting on the edge of the hotel
написал?
bed. I opened my secure laptop and connected to my private
А,
virtual network.
ты про
I
закреп.
needed to verify one final
У нас
detail
с
before I
Мотера-
initiated the next
О,
phase of my
кстати, у
plan.
Мозера
I
сегодня
pulled up
день
the remote statements
рождения.
for a
У
secondary
Умарова.
checking account I had
У
quietly been
Умарова в
auditing over
один
the
день
past 2 months.
Сника.
Mark
Я
had demanded his
запомнила.
$5,000 allowance with such
Мне
vicious
такое не
urgency that it made
предлагали,
me
а тебе
suspicious.
нужно?
Narcissists usually
Хорошо,
demand
будет
money for
еще
status
какая-нибудь
symbols or luxury
сходочка,
goods.
обязательно тебе на
But his
жопу
tone in the text
нарисую.
message carried a distinct edge of genuine panic.
Хотя у тебя
needed that
вроде
specific amount
отпечатки так
on this
мои
specific
на
day.
жопе есть.
For a specific reason. I traced the transaction history from the previous months.
Ты
There it
точно
was,
хочешь,
hidden beneath layers of mundane transfers.
чтобы я ответила
On the
на
first of
твой
every
вопрос?
month, exactly $4,500 was routed to an external account under the label Consulting Retainer. The receiving account belonged to a woman named Kayla. My private investigator had already delivered a comprehensive file on
пизда.
Kayla a week prior. She was a young, ambitious event coordinator Mark had met at a tech
Ну,
summit.
отвечай, я поэтому и
Initially,
спрашиваю.
I assumed it was a standard, tragic affair. I thought he was just another middle-aged man using his wife's money to impress a younger woman with romantic getaways and designer gifts. But looking at the rigid, identical transfers marked as a corporate retainer, the puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying precision. This was not just a romance. Kayla knew the truth about his finances. She knew he was not a real venture capitalist, and she had evidence of his fraudulent advisory promises to other women in her network. The monthly transfer was not an allowance for lavish dates. It was pure, unadulterated hush money. Mark was paying her to keep his magnificent illusion intact. If he missed that payment today, Kayla would likely expose his empty pockets and his fake investment portfolio to the very network he desperately tried to impress. The affair was completely secondary to the fraud. He was not threatening me because he was angry. He was threatening me because he was trapped in a web of his own lies. He needed my money to pay his blackmailer. I closed the laptop, feeling nothing but a profound, icy contempt. It was always about the image. People often wonder how an educated, successful woman could endure being a financial host for a manipulator for so long. Why didn't I just walk away the moment I realized he was using my money? The truth is, psychological conditioning does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical dripping of poison that alters your perception of reality, making you believe that you are the one failing the relationship. Mark was an absolute master of the grand gesture, especially when an audience was present. His greatest performance was always reserved for my elderly parents, Walter and Cora. My mother, Cora, had suffered a mild heart attack 2 years into our marriage and required frequent monitoring. Since I worked demanding hours at the corporate office, Mark eagerly volunteered to help. He would drive her to her cardiology appointments, pushing her wheelchair with the utmost gentleness. He would sit in their living room in Bellevue, drinking tea with my father, discussing baseball and acting like the perfect, devoted
Добро
son-in-law.
пожаловать.
My parents absolutely
А у
adored
меня, в
him.
принципе,
They saw a man who was
даже
deeply
если бы
committed to their
какие-то
daughter's
звонки
family.
поступали,
Whenever
у
Mark and I had
меня
an argument behind closed
ограничения,
doors,
я
whenever I
не
questioned his
вижу,
lack
не
of
слышу
income or his
звонков
massive credit
с
card bills,
незнакомых
he would subtly
номеров.
twist the narrative. He would look at me with profound disappointment and say that I was too obsessed with money, that I lacked emotional depth, and that he was sacrificing his own lucrative career opportunities to ensure my parents were cared for. I remember visiting my mother one Sunday after a particularly vicious argument with him about his
Парень
spending.
есть?
Cora held my
Два.
hand, her eyes filled with gentle concern. She told me, "Every marriage has rough
Маша,
patches.
ну, чтобы
Pearl,
тебя
maybe Mark
боялись,
just
то
feels
часть
small
не
next to your
боятся,
immense
че
success.
ночью будешь
He has such a
всех
good heart.
шугать.
You just need to
Не,
be
я
a
не
little more
хочу, чтобы тебя
patient with him."
боялись.
I
Я
swallowed my
просто
pride
хочу,
and my
чтобы мы все
intuition
были
entirely. I
друзьями.
convinced myself that his financial abuse was just a temporary
Жука
flaw
и
I had to
бука.
manage. I became trapped in a state of learned helplessness, paying his exorbitant bills simply to keep the peace and to preserve the beautiful illusion of a happy
Парень на
family for my
месте.
aging parents. But his devotion was a lie. His kindness
Первый,
was a
второй,
calculated
на
trap.
первый, второй раз
The illusion of a happy
считайся.
marriage is a heavy thing to carry, but the moment it
Же в
breaks,
курсе, что
the
все
clarity is
маги
almost
только из
blinding.
Хогвартса?
My absolute awakening did not happen in
Не
Chicago.
верю.
It happened 3 weeks
Ну,
earlier, on a quiet Tuesday evening in our Seattle penthouse.
может,
Mark was
связь
out at
мага,
another
кстати.
networking dinner, and my laptop was running a system update. I needed to print a quick corporate brief. So I opened
Не,
his
ну когда
computer,
ты
knowing
начнешь
he never
смотреть
bothered with
аниме, не
complex
будешь ничего
passwords.
говорить про
I was searching for the
Хогвартс.
downloads folder when my eyes caught a standalone directory on his desktop. It was simply titled Cora
У тебя
Docs.
здесь
I clicked
Слизерин.
it,
Я не
assuming
дам
it was
тебе
just the
сделать
standard medical
Слизерин,
insurance
если
forms he helped
что.
my mother manage. Instead,
Не
my screen
упрашиваю.
filled with scanned images of my parents' most sensitive information.
Скажи, хорошо, что у меня
There
нет
were high-resolution
дочери.
copies of Walter's driver's license,
А так бы
Cora's social
ночью,
security
мало
card,
ли
and their
что.
joint retirement account statements. But the final document in the folder was what truly froze the blood in my veins.
Вообще как тут
It was a
работает?
digital
Да
approval
вот.
letter for a high-limit credit card. The account was opened entirely under Walter's name, utilizing his pristine credit score. However, the recovery email address belonged to Mark's
Прикиньте, он что,
secondary
не
account.
зря
The
работает,
phone number
что
for
ли?
security verification was a prepaid line Mark kept in his briefcase, and the physical mailing address for the card was not my
Зря
parents' home
работал
in Bellevue.
сегодня так
It was a
долго.
private post office box rented in downtown Seattle. Taking my money was financial abuse.
Спасибо.
Stealing the identities of
Баста
elderly,
гуф.
trusting people under the guise of familial care was a calculated, predatory crime. He
Так,
was actively draining the resources they had spent a
о
lifetime building.
господи, помогите.
I did not confront him when
Ну
he
ты
came home.
коза, конечно.
I
Ты
simply copied the entire folder onto an encrypted drive.
думал, чё?
Before leaving his home office, I walked over to the wall safe hidden behind a bookshelf. I punched in the code and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. Inside was our post-nuptial agreement, a rigid legal document Mark had signed 4 years ago in exchange for a massive cash bailout to clear his personal debts.
Блин,
The
магия
document was still there,
ассоциируется
but I
с
noticed something unsettling. The flap of the
Гарри
envelope,
Поттером.
which I always sealed with a specific
Пиздец, ну в
alignment,
каком
was
веке?
slightly askew. Mark had opened it. He had read the clauses recently. He knew the legal boundary
Смотри, у меня в
existed,
титрах, детка.
and he was likely searching for a
Опа!
loophole to
А, это
invalidate
что-то
it.
новое?
He thought he
Подожди,
was staying
какое
one
новое?
step
Это
ahead
же
of me,
Баста и Гуф.
preparing for a potential battle
Что?
over
Гуф
assets.
жив?
I carefully placed the envelope back into the steel box. He had no idea I already held all
Ты
the cards.
думала, он
The game was
всё?
already over. There is a fundamental mistake that arrogant people make when navigating the world.
Подождите, мы
They
туда
treat
сюда
service workers
перейдём.
as invisible machinery. Mark was notoriously terrible to the staff at our luxury residential
Подождите.
building. He would snap at the
А
concierge if his
вы мне
packages were
щас
not
серьезно
instantly brought up.
скажите,
He would
Гуфман,
ignore the valets and
вот
speak down to the
говорят,
maintenance
Гуф
crew.
жив.
He demanded to be
Значит,
treated like a
Гуф
billionaire,
по-любому мертв.
entirely
А почему
unaware that
здесь
the people
написано
managing the
Гуф?
building saw right through his empty facade. I, on the other hand,
Чё?
knew their names. I knew Marcus at the front desk was putting his daughter through nursing school. I knew the head of security, David, had served in the military and valued quiet respect above all else.
Говорят,
I
жив.
treated them as equals
Блядь,
because
ну
they were the
вот,
true gatekeepers of my
значит, да.
sanctuary. When
А
I
Гуф
realized
умер.
Mark was leading a double
Блядь,
life,
подожди, я
I did not need to
запуталась.
hire expensive
Я
private
щас...
investigators to
Вот
monitor
вы
his
мне...
movements around our
Нет,
home. I simply went down to the
Гуф
lobby
жив
early one
или
morning,
нет?
handed Marcus a premium coffee, and asked a few polite
Рэпер
questions about
Гуф
building
Алексей
access logs,
Долматов жив.
because Mark had spent years alienating the
Слухая
staff.
его смерть,
They were more than
популярный
willing to assist the
интернет-мем.
primary leaseholder. Within 48 hours, David provided me with a highly detailed, secure printout of the digital entry system. The logs
То
showed
есть я
exactly when Mark's
попалась
access
на
fob was used.
фейк и всю
And more
жизнь
importantly,
думала, что
they showed the
Гуф
frequent guest
мертв.
passes authorized under his name. The data was meticulously organized. It showed a young woman, matching Kayla's description, entering the private elevators multiple times while I was at the corporate office. The security team also flagged unusual activity on the hallway cameras outside our specific unit. The footage clearly captured Mark physically
Но
tampering with
я
the blind
как бы не
spots near our front door.
слушаю.
He thought he was being stealthy, sneaking his mistress into my home and
Короче,
manipulating the
топтус
environment.
доносил чисто,
He never
чтобы
realized that the
похвастаться своей
very people he
работой.
treated like peasants were quietly recording his every misstep and handing the evidence directly to me.
Так, а что ты
A
здесь
narcissist's
конкретно делал,
greatest weakness
кстати?
is always their own inflated ego. They believe they are the smartest person in any room, blind to the silent
По
alliances
своей
forming
воле.
right behind their
Не,
backs.
мама меня
I gathered the
заставила.
access logs and slipped them into my leather briefcase. Every timestamp,
Говорит, раз
every
не
guest
детей,
authorization,
то все
and every
редакции.
camera glitch was another nail in his legal coffin. He had alienated the entire building. He was entirely surrounded now. The most dangerous assumption Mark made during our marriage was believing that, because we shared a bed, we shared everything. He frequently referred to the Seattle penthouse as our home. He would boast to his fake business associates about the panoramic views and the imported marble countertops,
Да, Mooch,
acting as though his non-existent
пусть
venture capital success had paid for the architecture.
Хорошо.
He operated under the
Будем,
common misconception that marriage automatically
искать
merges
пыль.
all assets into a single pot. But I am a corporate strategy director. I deal with risk mitigation for a living. I do not leave my personal sanctuary vulnerable to the unpredictable whims of another human being. Long before I ever walked down the aisle with Mark, I sat in a sterile legal office and structured my wealth. The penthouse was not purchased under the name Pearl. It was bought outright, in cash, by a private limited liability company. I was the sole managing member of that entity.
Так, лучки
From the day we moved
света.
in together, the financial boundaries were absolute. The property taxes, the exorbitant homeowner association fees,
Пока не
and the
вижу
maintenance
лучков.
costs were all paid exclusively from a separate banking account tied only to the LLC. Mark never contributed a single dollar to the upkeep of the property. He never signed the deed. His name never appeared on a single utility bill. In the eyes of the law, there was zero commingling of funds. The asset was hermetically sealed against any marital claims. Mark was not a co-owner. His legal status was nothing more than a permitted occupant. It
Я
is
не
a
знаю,
cold,
посмотрела на
clinical
Басту и
term,
вспомнила
but it is highly
Скинза.
effective in a court of law. It meant his right to reside in that penthouse existed only as long as I allowed it. He believed his presence gave him equity. He thought the law would naturally protect his right to a luxury lifestyle simply because he wore a wedding ring. He had no idea that the paperwork governing our living arrangement was tighter than a corporate merger. I had built a fortress around my financial stability.
Чё?
constructing walls of unassailable documentation. When the time came, he would not be fighting an emotional wife. He would be fighting an airtight corporate structure. The law does not care about your feelings or your lifestyle expectations. The law only respects the signature on the deed. My fortress was utterly impenetrable. Just a few days before my strategic departure to the Chicago conference, a courier delivered a sleek, unmarked cardboard box to the penthouse. The return address was a generic corporate mail center, but I knew exactly who had sent it. It was from Kayla. My private investigator had reached out to her anonymously, dropping just enough breadcrumbs to shatter her own illusion of Mark. She realized she was not dating a wealthy venture capitalist waiting for a divorce. She realized she was sleeping with a broke, middle-aged fraud who was funding their romance with his wife's corporate salary. Her reaction was swift and decisive. I carried the box to the kitchen island and opened it with a pair of scissors. Inside, perfectly folded, were 3 expensive silk ties. Beneath them lay a heavy, luxury diving watch, still in its presentation case. And resting at the bottom was a small, handwritten card. I recognized Mark's messy, hurried script immediately. I picked up the card and read the inscription, "To the woman who believed in me before the world did." I did not cry. I did not feel a sudden, crushing heartbreak. My emotional detachment was profound. I simply pulled out my phone and cross-referenced the brand of the watch and the ties with the recent statements from my secondary credit card. The dates and amounts matched perfectly. He had used my money to purchase romantic gifts for his mistress, funding his grand gestures with my labor. But the most damning item in the box was a small, silver USB drive. I plugged it into my laptop. It contained dozens of audio messages Mark had sent to Kayla. In one recording, his voice was dripping with arrogance as he told her, "Pearl is completely mentally unstable. She's obsessed with controlling my money. But don't worry, baby. Once I trigger the divorce, I am taking half of that penthouse and we are out of here." He was playing both of us, spinning lies to maintain his cash flow and his ego. Kayla was not just a villain in my story. She was another woman manipulated by his hollow promises. By sending the box, she had officially resigned from his game and handed me the final pieces of evidence I needed. I placed the USB drive into my secure folder. The evidence was now absolute. Revenge, when executed properly, is not a screaming match. It is a highly organized spreadsheet. Before I flew to Chicago, I spent 3 hours sitting in the quiet, glass-walled office of a premier forensic accountant in downtown Seattle. I did not want estimates. I demanded absolute, undeniable mathematical certainty regarding the damage Mark had inflicted upon my life. The accountant and I reviewed years of banking trails, credit histories, and property assessments. We isolated every single fraudulent transaction. When the final report was printed, the total debt owed to me was exactly $250,000. This was not an arbitrary number pulled from thin air to punish him. It was a cold, calculated breakdown of his liabilities. The first line item was $68,000 in unauthorized credit card charges, money spent entirely on Kayla, luxury hotels, designer bags, and premium flights. The second line item was $57,000 quietly funneled out of our accounts into his fake consulting retainer to buy her silence. Next was $41,000. This covered the physical damage he had caused to the penthouse during his temper tantrums, the unauthorized replacement of high-end technology, and the veterinary costs for Buster, when Mark had accidentally locked the dog out on the cold terrace overnight. Then came $36,000 in hard legal fees, forensic accounting services, emergency locksmiths, and cybersecurity measures required to protect my remaining assets. The final blow was $48,000 in liquidated damages. This was a specific clause triggered in our post-nuptial agreement, penalizing him for violating the financial fidelity terms we had strictly outlined. I stared at the heavy binder containing the audit. Every single dollar represented a moment I had worked late, a moment I had stressed over a presentation, a moment I had sacrificed my own peace for his comfort. He had drained $250,000 from my existence to fuel his pathetic
Жаден, ты
vanity.
сам сказал,
He
что
always
если
told me I
покажу,
was too
ты
focused on the balance
отпишешься, потому
sheet.
что я
He was
ошибок
about to learn
поставила.
exactly how unforgiving a balance sheet could be when the numbers were weaponized. The debt was legally binding, perfectly documented, and
Честно, ни
entirely
одного
inescapable.
дымка не
The math did
видела.
not lie.
Вот
When you pull a
скажи,
single
вот
thread on a
реально,
manipulator's
типа,
sweater,
хотя
you
бы
rarely
один
just unravel
тайминг,
one
где есть
lie.
дымок.
You usually unravel their entire ecosystem, sitting in that forensic accountant's office days before my Chicago trip. I expected to see the financial wreckage
Понимаю.
caused by Mark and his
Смотрю на
mistress,
тебя.
Kayla. What I did not expect was to discover a
На людей
sophisticated network of family
смотрела.
parasitism.
На кого
The
мне еще
accountant pointed to a
смотреть?
series of wire transfers buried
Все
deep within the bank
вместе
statements.
старалась
Over the course of
захватывать.
3 years, Mark had moved significant sums of money into an obscure shell company listed as a consulting firm. We traced the
Помню,
corporate
завтра тебе
registration of that
скринов
specific
накидаю.
entity. It did not
Хорошо.
belong to a tech founder or a legitimate vendor.
Вашу
The company was
работу не
registered to Marlene,
заметили.
Mark's
Придется
older,
кидать
endlessly
скрины.
arrogant sister. Marlene had always treated me with a thinly veiled condescension. She lived in a sprawling house in the suburbs, hosted extravagant charity luncheons,
Мне
and
очень жаль
constantly
тебя,
reminded me that I
Капитан. Ты
worked too
такой
much while her
ценный
brother was a
работник, и я даже не
visionary investor.
заметила,
She
что
loved
ты
to lecture me on how a
делал.
wife should be more supportive of her husband's brilliant entrepreneurial mind. Looking at the audit, the sickening truth washed over me. Marlene's lavish
Она
lifestyle
будет
was
так
partially funded by the
всегда,
very money her
где?
brother was
У
embezzling from my
кого?
corporate salary. He was transferring thousands of dollars into her shell
Завтра
company
я
under the guise of fake
погорячился.
investment seed capital.
Сегодня.
She was
Сегодня?
not just a naive sister believing her brother's lies.
Да.
She was an active, willing participant in his financial fraud.
200 рублей
She took my
дымок
money to
тебе
buy her
дам.
status symbols,
Дымок.
all while looking down her nose at the
Дымок
woman paying her
потол-
bills.
потолок.
Mark's entire family operated like a
Как
syndicate
идея
of
так
leeches,
себе, да?
protecting his fake
Вообще,
venture
я
capitalist
тоже
persona
не
because it
понимаю.
kept the cash flowing into their own
Прикол.
pockets. They fed on my hard work while actively despising me for being the provider.
Тема дает
I did not
общую
feel
картину,
anger toward
прикол-то в
Marlene.
этом.
I felt a cold, surgical precision
Мне
settling
кажется,
into my
это может
bones. The
профессионал
audit now
видеть
included her corporate routing
именно
numbers and the
отдельно
exact dates of the
деталями.
fraudulent transfers.
А
When the
так,
time came to dismantle Mark's life, his
а так
sister would
мы,
not
да,
be
мы
able to offer
видим
him a
общую
safe harbor.
картину, не
If she
понимаем,
tried to
что
protect him,
меняется, а что
she
не
would implicate
меняется.
herself in a massive financial crime.
Не
The whole
сравниваем
family was
картинку
guilty.
с этим
Let
и
us
без
return to the
этого.
darkness of my Chicago hotel room. The text message from Mark was still glowing on my screen. Wire the $5,000 allowance right now, or I
Буси
will
схожи
divorce
с
you.
буб, значит,
A threat of
сиськи на
divorce is
бусину,
usually
на
designed to
сиськи.
induce panic. A manipulator
Ладно,
uses it
точно
as the
спать.
ultimate weapon to force a spouse into
Да,
immediate
давай,
submission.
давай.
Mark
Всё.
had used this exact
Много с
phrase a
нами
dozen times
посидел.
over the last 4
Спасибо
years whenever I
большое.
questioned his
Заходи.
spending. He thought it
Еще.
was his trump card. He thought the mere mention of ending
Если
our
ты
marriage
всё
would send me
брать такое,
scrambling
я
to my
обещаю
banking
получше,
application.
несмотря на
Instead,
чужое.
I took a pristine screenshot of the message and
Интересно
forwarded it directly
посмотреть
to Vivian,
разницу.
my attorney in Seattle.
Да
My
я
phone
ж
buzzed 3
сиськи
minutes later.
закачала. Так
Vivian's
сиськи-то
voice on the other
есть,
end was
ребят.
perfectly level,
Будьте,
but I could hear the
подписывайтесь,
distinct edge
Векторный
of
театр.
professional satisfaction. I received the image. Pearl,
Постов
she said
новых
quietly.
много.
Are you absolutely certain
Ну,
he typed this of his own free will?
до
Yes,
29
I
мая.
replied.
Ваня.
He is angry because his mistress requires her hush money today.
Больше
Vivian let out a soft
после этого
chuckle.
не
He did
выкладывала.
not just threaten you, Pearl. He
Те,
just served
что
himself the final
блокаут,
judgment.
вообще
4
да.
years ago,
Но я
when
не
Mark
скажу, что
begged
они
me to
прям
pay off his
полный
massive gambling
блокаут. Я
debts,
видела
I
где-то
forced him to sign a
рилсы,
post-nuptial agreement. It was an
где вот
ironclad
прям
document drafted by
полный
Vivian's firm.
блокаут. У меня
Hidden within the
немножко
standard clauses was a very
просвечивается,
specific indemnification trigger.
но не прям
The contract clearly
сильно.
stated that if either party used the threat of divorce as a mechanism for financial
Из-за
extortion
пацаны на так
or
старые
engaged in
посты
documented
в
financial
бане.
infidelity,
Да, тебе нельзя
the
больше
asset protection clauses would
подписываться.
immediately activate. By demanding $5,000 under the explicit threat of dissolving our
Не, по
marriage,
факту
Mark
можно,
had legally
но
committed financial
сам
extortion.
знаешь.
He had single-handedly bypassed any need for a prolonged,
Ты видел
messy legal debate.
посты,
His text message was the digital
получается...
equivalent of turning the key in
Сейчас
his own
скажу,
prison
сколько
door.
ты не
The law does
видел.
not care about your mood swings or your empty threats. The law cares about documented
Э,
intent. I did not have to fight him in a
Блин,
courtroom to prove he was abusive. I just had to present the screenshot to the judge to
сейчас,
activate the financial
сейчас.
penalties
Мне
we had
даже
already
самой
agreed upon.
интересно.
He signed his own sentence. The execution of a financial separation must be handled like a corporate restructuring swiftly,
Ты не
silently,
видела
and without any room for
раз,
emotional hesitation.
два,
Sitting at the
три,
hotel desk in Chicago,
четыре,
I opened
пять,
my secure notebook and began the process of systematically
семь,
erasing
восемь,
Mark's access to my
9
resources.
постов.
My first call was to the Platinum credit card concierge. I spoke in a calm,
Были
measured
бы
tone,
год другой
instructing them to
делать.
immediately
Там
freeze
так
all secondary cards
эротика.
issued under my primary account.
Делать мне
The
блин,
representative
голые
confirmed
фотки
the action within
выставляют.
60
Чё?
seconds. Mark's ability to purchase luxury
Если
dinners,
выключить свет,
book hotel
попугай
rooms for
сразу
Kayla,
тихо
or
спрячется в
fund his fake
клетку, но
investor
вообще
lifestyle
я не
was
скажу, что
instantly
здесь
terminated.
прям
My
капец
second
как
task was
светло.
digital.
Но
I
они
logged
все
into our
равно
joint
кричат,
checking account,
бывает, в
which I
темноте.
exclusively
Ну, от
funded.
настроения
I
зависит.
initiated a wire transfer, moving
Ну, как бы
99% of the
нихуя,
balance
ну,
into a
как
newly
бы
established
да.
private trust account that Mark did not know
Как бы
existed.
да.
I left exactly $42 in the joint account, just enough to cover a
Вот
cheap cab
поэтому
ride,
говорю,
but
дай
nowhere near the
сиськи за
$5,000 he needed.
вайчаном.
Next, I dialed the property management office of my Seattle penthouse
Да,
because
вы
I
мне
was the
еще
sole managing member of the limited
Слимана.
liability company that owned the unit. My instructions were absolute law.
За
I
сиськи.
informed the head of security that Mark's
За
status as a permitted
письки.
occupant was officially revoked. Effective immediately,
Спасибо.
I
Ну, спасибо
authorized
за
an
Сбер,
emergency locksmith to
спасибо, как
dispatch
бы
to the
я
penthouse and
согласна.
replace the front door cylinders with a new biometric lock system.
Даже
My final call was the
большое
most important.
спасибо.
I contacted David, the head of building security, who had
Так,
already reviewed the footage of Mark tampering with the dog feeder. I asked David to personally escort my golden retriever, Buster, out of the penthouse and deliver him to a luxury pet boarding facility I had pre-booked in downtown Seattle. David
я
assured
вот
me the dog would be
думаю,
safe and completely out of Mark's reach. Within
сколько еще
45
мне с вами
minutes, the
стрелять?
entire operation was complete. I had not shed a tear.
Что, все
I had not
потихонечку
raised my
спать
voice.
уже идут?
I simply utilized the systems I had put in place to protect myself. Mark was currently wandering around Seattle, completely oblivious to the fact that his credit cards were dead. His bank
Сколько?
account was empty,
Сколько,
and his home
сколько?
no longer belonged to him. The fortress was completely locked. It took exactly 3 hours for reality to catch up with Mark. I was sitting in a quiet cafe near the Chicago Conference Center,
Потому что
sipping a black
обещал до
coffee,
утра, и как
when my
бы
phone
вот
screen
оно
began to light
утро.
The caller identification flashed Mark's
С
name
другой
repeatedly.
стороны,
10
не
missed
могу
calls
сказать,
turned into
что...
20.
Ну, то есть, мне
Then
как
came the
будто
barrage of
нехуй
text
делать.
messages, each one more frantic and erratic than the
Ёбаный
last. My card
до
just declined at the
7.
restaurant. Fix this right now.
Вообще могу
Pearl,
до 7
answer the phone.
посидеть.
The bank is saying the joint account is empty. Where is my $5,000?
Давай тебе не мне
I placed the phone
сейчас.
face up on the table and simply watched the notifications roll in.
Говорю.
I did not touch the device. The silence from my end was a deliberate,
Да, до
suffocating
8.
wait.
Нет, до
I knew
8
exactly what was
нет
happening in
уже,
Seattle.
наверное.
He
До
was standing in
7
front of his
где-то.
peers, trying to play the wealthy venture capitalist. only to have a waiter hand him back a declined piece of plastic. Then, the true panic set in. My security application notified me that someone was attempting to access the penthouse. I watched the live feed from the hallway camera. Mark was standing in front of our heavy oak door, aggressively swiping his electronic key fob. The scanner flashed red. He swiped it again, slamming his hand against the scanner pad. He leaned close to the camera, his face twisted in an ugly, desperate rage. He left a voicemail that transcribed directly to my screen. You locked me out. Are you insane? If you do not open this door and wire my money in the next 10 minutes, I am driving straight to Walter and Cora's house. Let's see how much your sick parents enjoy dealing with me. He was still trying to play the tyrant. He genuinely believed that threatening my elderly parents would make me crumble. He did not realize that my parents were already safely relocated to a private rental in Bellevue, completely insulated from his tantrums. He was a king screaming at a locked door, demanding obedience from a kingdom that no longer existed. If you've ever watched a manipulator lose their power, you know exactly how sweet this moment is. Type justice if you agree. His illusion was finally shattering. The Chicago conference concluded perfectly. I delivered my keynote presentation on corporate risk management, received a standing ovation from my peers, and calmly returned to my hotel room to pack my belongings. It was time to fly back to Seattle and finish the dismantling of Mark's fraudulent life. I opened my leather briefcase and meticulously organized the physical evidence. I did not want digital files. I wanted tangible, undeniable paper that I could place directly onto a table. I am a firm believer in the sheer, terrifying weight of documented proof. I arranged the documents in a very specific order of execution. First, the registered deed of the limited liability company, proving I was the sole owner of the penthouse. Second, the thick forensic audit detailing the $250,000 he owed me. Third, the credit card fraud report containing Walter and Cora's stolen identities, neatly highlighting Mark's recovery email address. Next, I placed the bank statements showing the continuous hush money payments to Kayla, proving his entire venture capitalist persona was a funded lie. Finally, I tucked the small silver USB drive into the interior pocket. It held the audio recordings of him degrading me to his mistress, and the video footage of him arrogantly bragging about signing the post-nuptial agreement. Looking at the organized stack, I felt a deep sense of professional pride. This was not a messy divorce fueled by tears and broken plates. This was a flawless corporate termination. Mark had treated our marriage like a parasitic business transaction, draining my resources while offering nothing but liabilities in return. Now, the board of directors was stepping in to liquidate his position. I zipped the briefcase shut and grabbed my coat. The flight back to the West Coast would take 4 hours. I knew Mark would be waiting for me in the lobby of the penthouse building. He would be exhausted, furious, and utterly desperate to regain control of his marriage. He probably had a speech prepared about how I was ruining his life over a misunderstanding. I walked out of the hotel room and headed toward the airport. I was not a terrified wife returning to an abusive husband. I was ready for war. I sat in the plush leather seat of the black car service, watching the rain-slicked streets of Seattle glide past the tinted windows. The flight back from Chicago had been incredibly smooth, allowing me 4 uninterrupted hours to mentally rehearse every single step of my impending execution. My phone had remained strictly in airplane mode, but the moment I landed and reconnected to the cellular network, a digital avalanche flooded my screen. There were 34 missed calls from Mark. There were dozens of voice messages, each one escalating in volume and desperation. I did not listen to a single word he had recorded. I did not need to hear his voice to know exactly what he was saying. I knew his predictable patterns better than he knew himself. He would start by demanding the $5,000.
Дардаре,
He would pivot
концертный
to
зал
playing the victim,
Санкт-Петербург.
claiming I was abandoning him in his hour of need. Finally, he would resort to threats, promising to destroy my reputation or harass my aging parents if I did not instantly comply with his demands. He was a creature of absolute routine, and his routine was powered entirely by my money. As the car navigated through the evening traffic, the glowing skyline of downtown Seattle came into view. My luxury penthouse building stood tall against the dark clouds. I felt an unexpected wave of profound serenity wash over my chest. For 4 years, the prospect of confronting Mark had always filled my stomach with a nauseating knot of anxiety. I had spent countless evenings walking on eggshells, carefully modulating my tone to avoid
Роль в
triggering his
официальном
volatile
клипе
ego.
проекта
I had funded his
«Mooch»
extravagant
разъебала
lifestyle simply to
исполнила
purchase a few
актриса
hours of quiet
Полина
peace in my own home. But tonight,
Захожая.
that paralyzing fear was entirely
Значит,
gone.
подожди, значит,
It had
реальная
been replaced by a
девчонка,
cold, surgical precision.
ну там
I checked
типа
the
часть
contents of my
сделана
leather briefcase one last
нейросеткой.
time. The documents were organized flawlessly. The evidence was
Сейчас долго
irrefutable.
го на
I was not
полчаса.
a terrified
Ты уже
spouse creeping
устал
back
от
into
меня,
a toxic environment.
Ты
I was a
можешь
corporate director arriving to
полчаса.
finalize a hostile takeover. The car pulled up to the grand entrance of the high-rise building. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets, splashing against the pristine pavement. David, the head of the building's security team, stepped out from under the awning holding a large black umbrella. He opened my car door with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Pearl," David said quietly. "He is waiting in the main reception lobby. He has been causing a significant disturbance for the past 3 hours. We have kept him isolated from the residential elevators as you instructed."
Нет таких
I stepped out of the
ужасных
vehicle and
красивых
straightened the
домиков
collar of my tailored
пятиэтажек.
coat. I gripped the handle of my
Ты
briefcase.
соскучился по ним,
"Thank you,
Спанч Боб?
David," I replied evenly. "Let us go inside." I walked through the revolving doors, feeling the cool rush of air-conditioned air hit my face. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. I was completely prepared to watch his entire universe collapse. There was no turning back. The storm had officially arrived. The grand marble lobby of my building was usually a sanctuary of quiet luxury, filled with soft classical
Нет, не
music and the scent of fresh
скучаешь.
lilies. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was thick with tension. As I stepped past the security checkpoint, the noise hit me immediately.
Если, бля,
Mark was
почти
pacing
хочешь
violently
донать.
back and forth in front
Ну
of the
так
main
не
concierge
всегда
desk.
же такое.
His appearance was
Иногда
completely
такое.
unraveled. The
Маш,
expensive
когда
Italian
уж
suit I had purchased for
работу
his birthday was
найдешь,
wrinkled.
да.
His silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his hair was unkempt. Several wealthy
Виски
residents were
горячий,
standing near the
подписывай,
bank of
молодец.
elevators,
Спасибо,
deliberately
только
avoiding eye contact with
подожди,
him
я
while
не
watching
знаю,
the
что
spectacle
ты
unfold.
подписывался
When
на
Mark
мой
finally
бусти.
noticed me walking across the polished
Какой
floor,
тебе ник?
he stopped
на
dead
бусти?
in his tracks. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest.
Тоже были
There she
советы,
is!
но
He
все
shouted, his voice echoing harshly against the high ceilings. "Are you completely out of your mind? Pearl, you lock your own husband out of his home over a minor financial disagreement.
советы.
I did not
Советы.
flinch.
Подумала,
I did not
какие
step backward.
советы.
I did not
Типа
raise my
советские
hands in a
издания?
defensive posture. I simply stopped walking and looked at him. Without his polished veneer, he looked incredibly pathetic. Where
Кстати,
is my
как я помню, Спанч Боб, ты
$5,000?
вроде
He demanded, taking another aggressive step
немного в
toward me,
России жил или
clearly
вообще
attempting
не
to
жил
use
в
his physical presence
России,
to
или
intimidate me
что-то
into
путаю.
submission. And why is
Чего
my key
такое
card
быть?
deactivated? Tell these glorified security guards to let me up to my apartment right now. He was operating under the delusion that I would feel embarrassed by his public outburst. He expected me to desperately shush him, to grab his arm and pull him into a private corner to negotiate a swift
Это
surrender to save face.
просто
He wanted me to act like the submissive
приукрашиваешь
wife he had meticulously trained me to be.
Просто
I did no such thing.
переигрываешь,
I let his aggressive
понимаешь?
words hang in the dead air. I let the
Не
silence
жил.
stretch
Ну
out,
вот, да. Наверное,
allowing the sheer
поэтому не
embarrassment of his
скучаешь.
behavior to echo through the lobby. The
Хуяна.
concierge staff stood perfectly
Видите,
still,
как он с
watching
ним
my lead.
разговаривает?
I
Он
looked
еще
Mark directly in the
видно.
eyes. My expression
Он
was a mask of
дает
absolute, unfeeling
пример
stone.
другим
Are
зрителям,
you
то,
quite
что со
finished?
мной так
I asked
можно.
quietly. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my complete lack of emotional reaction. What is wrong with you? He stammered, his volume dropping slightly. I need that money. Pearl, you have no right to do this to me. You have no right to humiliate me in front of these people. Mark
Третий
hissed,
капитан.
glancing nervously at the
How are
onlookers.
you?
He was finally realizing that his
Доброе
loud
утро,
demands were only
получается.
destroying his own carefully crafted public image. The wealthy investors he always tried to impress in the elevators were now witnessing him throwing a desperate tantrum over an allowance. His facade was crumbling in real time. I simply held my ground, watching his panic rise to the surface. I refused to offer him a single drop of comfort. He was entirely on his own. He had absolutely zero leverage. I stepped past Mark's trembling frame and walked directly to the main marble counter. Marcus, the head concierge, stood at strict
Вы
attention,
знали, как
his
она
hands
влияет на нас
clasped behind his
близких,
back.
так сказать?
Good evening,
Как?
Miss Pearl,
Если бы я на вас как-то
Marcus said with
влияла,
profound
вы все были
professional
на
courtesy.
бусе.
Good evening, Marcus,
Вообще-то.
I replied. I placed my heavy leather briefcase onto the polished stone surface and snapped the twin brass locks open. The sound was sharp and definitive in the quiet lobby. Mark hovered right behind my shoulder, his breathing erratic and heavy with panic. I asked you a
Как
direct question.
муж?
Pearl. Mark
Какой
hissed
муж?
through clenched
Чей
teeth.
муж?
Are you going to tell them to let me into my home? I slowly pulled out the
Привет,
first
берлога.
thick manila folder. It contained the operating
Блин,
agreement,
смотрю, твои
the
прошлые
tax
сообщения,
records,
писали
and the
ты
registered deed for
что-то
the limited
вообще
liability
сегодня.
company.
Твое прошлое
I turned around to
сообщение,
face
Митра
him.
алкаш.
You keep using the word your home. Mark, I
Были
said,
в бане
my voice
давно.
perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotional
Что
warmth.
ты нас гонишь
That
куда-то
is
на
fundamentally
бусе? Что там
incorrect.
такое?
I
Нет,
slid the
там
heavy
ничего
stack of
нет,
documents across the
ребят.
marble counter toward him. This penthouse is owned outright by a private
Спасибо,
corporate entity.
капитан.
I am the sole
Мне не
managing member
влияет
of that
ни
entity.
иммунитет. Да
The
ну
property
еще
was purchased
кончено. Он до
entirely
сих пор не
prior to our
фолловер,
marriage,
понимаете?
and all
У него
maintenance,
1000
taxes,
плюс
and homeowner
сообщений, он до
fees
сих пор не
have been paid
фолловер.
exclusively from an isolated corporate account.
Я думаю, он по
I
мальчику.
watched his bloodshot eyes frantically scan the legal text on the first page. There has been absolutely zero commingling of marital funds. You are not a co-owner. You do not possess a single
Наша
percentage of equity.
вседозволенность.
Under the strict definitions of the law, you were simply a permitted
Ah.
occupant. Mark's jaw slackened. The remaining color drained completely from his face as the brutal
У вас
reality
по
of the
факту
paperwork finally pierced his
вседозволенность.
arrogance.
Почти
He had
что.
always believed that his mere presence in my bed gave him a legal right to my wealth. I formally revoked your permission to occupy my property at noon today, I stated, locking my eyes onto his.
Не, я
You are not a resident here.
проанализирую
You are currently
предыдущие
trespassing in a private building.
ситуации,
Mark stumbled
делаю
backward,
вывод,
physically
что
reacting to the
реально у вас
absolute finality of my words.
пиперов
The fortress
как
of
будто
documents
бы
I had
реально
built years ago was now fully
вседозволенность
deployed.
всё.
He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a counter-argument, trying to find a loophole in my corporate structure.
Нам
But
на
we
это
are
же
married,
пытались
he choked out,
манипулировать. И чё,
voice weak.
получилось?
A judge will grant me
Как
marital rights to the
манипулировать?
primary residence.
Расскажи,
You
я
cannot
хочу
just legally evict your
поподробнее
husband.
здесь.
I let out a soft, dry laugh. You should have consulted a competent financial attorney before you spent 4 years insulting my intelligence. I replied, an irrevocable corporate structure predating a marriage does not magically dissolve because you decided to hang your cheap suits in my
Владимир,
custom
спасибо за
closet.
бесплатную
You have no
подписку
legal
на
standing
Boost.
here. Mark, He stared at the documents,
Увы, но
finally
нет.
understanding that his luxurious lifestyle had vanished forever. We are just getting started. If you love seeing justice served on
Напомнил мне,
paper,
ну, типа,
let me know in the
увы, но
comments.
нет.
The
Это
law was
приятно
utterly
знать,
merciless.
но тем не менее.
Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the lobby slid
Поводу
open,
шуток
and
про
Vivian walked in. My attorney looked
Говно?
immaculate in a sharp charcoal suit,
Гондоны.
carrying her own sleek briefcase. The clicking of her heels against the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a metronome. Mark stared at her in utter disbelief. He recognized Vivian instantly from the day he had signed our post-nuptial agreement 4 years
Видишь, я не
ago.
фоллоу и не
What is she
VIP,
doing here?
поэтому почти что
Mark stammered,
скромный. Ну
pointing
да,
a shaky
поэтому в
finger at
случае
Vivian.
чего тебе прилетит
This is a
сразу.
private marital discussion. You do not need a lawyer to unlock my door. Vivian did not even acknowledge his pathetic
Можно
attempt to
даже
dictate
рот
the
не
rules of
разевать.
engagement. She walked directly to my side and opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency. Good evening, Mark, Vivian said in a clinical,
Wow.
detached tone. My client is executing a full financial and legal separation based on your documented, repeated breaches of contract.
Да,
Mark
пудрил.
let out a harsh, desperate laugh, trying to summon a fraction of his old arrogance. Breaches? What breaches? Because I asked my wife for my standard $5,000 allowance. Vivian pulled out a heavily annotated bank statement and placed it precisely on top of the property deed. We are referring to the exact sum of $4,500 you wire on the first of every month to an external account belonging to Kayla, Vivian stated, her voice projecting clearly across the lobby space. The transfers you explicitly labeled as a consulting retainer, Mark staggered back as if an invisible force had struck him directly in the chest. You have been utilizing my client's corporate salary to purchase the silence of your mistress. Vivian continued relentlessly. Kayla has provided us with comprehensive written statements and audio recordings. They confirm that you falsely presented yourself as a highly successful venture capitalist, collecting fraudulent strategic advisory fees from young female founders while strictly using my client's capital to maintain your illusion. His entire elite persona evaporated into thin air. The wealthy neighbors who had lingered near the elevators gasped softly, the whispers starting immediately. He was not a high-powered investor making market-shifting decisions. He was an unemployed fraud, utilizing his wife's paycheck to fund hush money payments to cover up his pathetic lies. His ultimate nightmare had materialized. He was completely exposed. Mark looked frantically around the lobby, his eyes darting toward the residents who were now looking at him with undisguised contempt. The social standing he had sacrificed my sanity to build was completely demolished in less than 2 minutes. Kayla is lying, he whispered, his voice cracking. She is a crazy woman trying to extort me. Pearl, you cannot possibly believe her over your own husband. I simply stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. He was still trying to gaslight me, still trying to shift the blame onto the very woman he had manipulated. Kayla sent me the flash drive. Mark, I said softly. I heard the audio recordings. I heard you call me mentally unstable. I heard you brag about stealing my assets. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged and shallow. He had nothing left to say. The silence was incredibly loud. The revelation regarding Kayla and his fraudulent venture capital business left Mark completely paralyzed. He opened his mouth to defend himself, desperately trying to spin another elaborate narrative to save his ego. But his mind simply short-circuited under the weight of the evidence. He looked around the lobby, fully realizing that his carefully curated reputation among these wealthy Seattle residents was permanently destroyed. But I was not finished. Destroying his public image was merely the preliminary step. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the second thick folder. It was packed with credit reports, digital banking logs, and application timestamps. I slapped it down onto the marble desk right next to the hush money receipts. The sound made Mark flinch.
Как говорят,
Cheating on me and squandering my money on a
как
fake
говорят,
empire is a civil
стрим не
issue,
хуй, сиди
Mark.
кайфуй.
I said, my voice dropping to a freezing,
Честно,
absolute whisper. But this folder represents a severe criminal indictment. I opened the cover to display the high-limit credit card approval letter. You volunteered to help my elderly father with his complex Medicare paperwork. You sat in his living room, drinking his tea, and you used that intimate access to steal Walter and Cora's
сколько
social
год
security
нужно
numbers.
сидеть?
Mark's eyes widened in sheer terror.
Ой, ну,
The blood rushed out of his face,
как
leaving his
бы,
skin a
я
sickly,
не
pale
говорю,
gray.
сколько прямо.
That is not true, he choked out,
Год,
backing away.
полгода,
I
два
was just
года,
helping them
3
organize
года,
their
5 лет.
files. I never
В
stole
плане,
anything.
насколько
You opened a
часто,
massive line
чтобы
of
у нас
consumer credit utilizing their
появлялись
pristine
какие-то
financial
общие
history.
приколы, что ты
Vivian
понимал,
interjected
что человек
sharply, pointing a manicured
адекватный,
finger at the
что
highlighted
если им
text.
интересно,
You
что
tied the
человеку
recovery
интересно
email to your
со
secondary
мной.
digital
Короче,
address,
такие более
and you
дружеские
deliberately had the
отношения,
physical
они
card
могут
mailed to a
хоть, я не
private
знаю,
post
за
office
пару
box in
месяцев
downtown Seattle to bypass their home mailbox. The severity of the crime hung incredibly heavy in the cold air. He had not just stolen from a wealthy wife who could absorb the financial blow. He had deliberately preyed
Что у вас
upon
навязчивая
vulnerable,
идея встретиться с
sick,
стримером?
elderly
У нас
people
фотка
who
просто
trusted him
была.
implicitly as a son. This was
Я
elder
ещё
financial
проклянул,
abuse
если бы я
and
так
felony
сказал,
identity theft.
мы просто не
The evidence was
поверили.
pristine and completely
Конечно,
undeniable.
видел метрополитен.
My parents loved you,
Что?
I said, staring directly into his terrified eyes.
Кого?
And you monetized their affection. He
Да
began to shake
ладно,
uncontrollably,
ты врешь.
realizing he was facing actual prison time.
Все
He was a predator
6
caught in a snare.
утра.
There was no escape.
Нет, там
I can explain
в
everything,
камине
Mark pleaded,
6
his voice
утра.
cracking into a pathetic whine. I was going to pay it all back.
Фотография
I just needed a temporary
твоя.
bridge loan for a major investment deal. I swear to God. Pearl, I never intended to hurt Walter or Cora.
Я
I felt a
после
sickening wave of revulsion. He was still calling them by their first names, still pretending there was a shred of familiarity left between us. You do not get to say their names ever again, I commanded quietly. The fraud division of the bank has already been notified, and all authorized records have been submitted to the authorities. You did not secure a bridge loan. You committed a felony against my family. His knees visibly buckled. His destruction was beautifully absolute. The absolute silence in the luxury lobby was now deafening. Mark was visibly trembling, his eyes darting between the irrefutable evidence of his identity theft and the cold, unyielding expressions of the building's security team. He realized he could not charm his way out of a federal crime, so his survival instinct forced him to pivot back to his only remaining defense, attacking our marital contract. You cannot do this to me, Mark sputtered, wiping a layer of cold sweat from his forehead. You cannot just throw me out and freeze everything. That post-nuptial agreement is completely fraudulent. You forced me to sign it when I was under extreme financial duress. I did not even have proper legal representation. A family court judge will tear that document into 1,000 pieces. Vivian did not blink. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out the third and final thick binder. She dropped it onto the marble counter with a heavy, satisfying thud. It was the complete forensic audit, bound in stark black leather. We welcome a judicial review, Mark, Vivian stated smoothly. In fact, we have already prepared the civil filing. This audit details the exact sum of $250,000 you owe my client. It meticulously chronicles your unauthorized credit card charges, the fraudulent hush money transfers to your mistress, the calculated property damage, and the liquidated damages clause you activated the moment you threatened divorce to extort $5,000. Mark stared at the heavy binder as if it were a venomous snake. The astronomical
Некоторым
number seemed to
заходил,
finally
может,
crush the
раз
remaining air
10
from his
дружим,
lungs.
они уже и не стримят.
$250,000,
вы
he whispered,
дружите
his
не
voice
как
completely hollow.
стример-зритель,
That is
как бы
impossible.
в целом,
You
вне
cannot hold me
Твича,
responsible for
то
that. I am your
почему
husband.
нет?
We share assets. You share
Ты
absolutely
видела, что я
nothing.
писал
I
выше
corrected him
час
quietly.
назад?
You spent 4 years treating my corporate salary like an endless well for your ego. You bought expensive dinners to
Это
impress
то
strangers
самое
while calling me a
сообщение
burden.
среди 200
Every single
твоих
dollar you stole has
сообщений,
been
которое
traced,
было час
documented,
назад.
and officially categorized
Да,
as a civil
кажется, я
liability.
припоминаю
He
то
looked at me with a mixture of
самое.
pure hatred and sheer terror. He knew he did not possess even a fraction of that money. He knew his bank accounts were frozen and his credit was obliterated. I will
Какой
not pay it,
тату?
Mark hissed defensively. I will hire a defense attorney and fight you for years. I
Обещали
will
сделать
bankrupt you in
поближе
legal
ко мне,
fees before I ever
чтобы
give you a single dime.
я
He was
смог на
clinging to a
выходные
phantom threat.
приехать.
The trap was fully closed.
Это
There is
вообще
a distinct difference
прекрасно.
between a
Тебя
threat
там
born from
ценят,
power and a
тебя там
threat born
любят.
from absolute desperation. Mark's promise to drag me through years of expensive litigation was
Может быть, в
laughable,
этом месяце в
considering he
СПБ
currently
поеду?
did not even have the funds to pay
Так,
for a taxi ride out
но
of
это не
downtown
точно.
Seattle. However,
Ну,
Vivian and I were not going to
окей,
leave him with even a
хорошо.
microscopic
А что
sliver
ты
of
будешь
hope.
делать?
We were there to dismantle him completely. You will not be fighting us in
А
court,
причина
Mark,
какая?
Vivian
СПБ?
said calmly. She reached into her briefcase and extracted a sleek silver tablet.
Я вот даже
She woke
думаю,
the
если
screen and
собираюсь
tapped a
снова
single video
схватка,
file.
это, наверное,
You seem
вообще
to have forgotten the
абсолютно
specific circumstances under which you
другие люди
executed the
все
post-nuptial
будет.
agreement 4 years ago. Vivian
Ну,
turned the tablet around so the bright
кроме
screen faced
какой-нибудь
Mark directly.
допринг, наверное.
She pressed play. The high-definition video
Ты меня
filled the
плохо
quiet space.
представляешь, я не
It was a
такой
recording Mark had filmed
скромный,
of himself
руки
on
не
his own
позволю
mobile device,
вытирать все
sitting in the
великолепные
passenger seat of a luxury
квадратные
sports car he had
штаны.
rented for a weekend. He was wearing a designer suit
То
and
есть
holding a
он
glass of champagne.
спрашивает.
His face was flushed with the arrogant
Юридические
thrill of a recent
вопросики,
victory.
блин,
His own
капец.
voice echoed back at him from the
Юридические
tablet's
вопросики
speakers.
аж в СПБ.
Best negotiation of my entire
Я
life,
думала, ты
the
знаешь,
digital
типа
Mark
приколы
boasted to the camera,
катаешься постоянно.
laughing loudly. I just signed some boring marriage document,
Типа,
let the lawyers
я
read the
это
fine print,
скатаюсь,
and got
можешь
all my massive
фоточку
debts
сделай.
completely wiped clean by my lovely wife. I am an absolute genius. The video
Вообще
ended,
недавно была
leaving
на
a harsh,
сходке, только
ringing
не на
silence in its
своей.
wake. Mark stood frozen, his
Девчонки,
mouth hanging slightly open. He was
токси-фокси.
staring at the ghost of his own extreme arrogance. He
Поэтому
had filmed
у
that video
меня
to
как
brag
будто
to his
бы
degenerate
детокс
friends
от
about
фоток
manipulating me into
сейчас.
paying off his gambling debt.
Хотя это было
He never realized that the
прикольно.
digital file had automatically
Но я
backed
не
up to our
хочу
shared cloud
пить.
storage,
Может быть,
perfectly preserving
максимум
his
пиво
confession of
возьму и
absolute
все.
sobriety, willing participation, and sheer manipulative intent. You were not coerced, Vivian stated,
Не.
shutting the tablet screen off.
Так,
You were
чит-чат,
fully
да,
competent,
ставлю.
highly enthusiastic, and
Только
legally
мы 5
represented by a
минут
lawyer you chose
прослушаем,
to
потому
ignore.
что за
This
баллы
video,
канала
combined with your
ограничение 5
signature,
минут.
makes the contract utterly bulletproof. The final pillar of his defense simply disintegrated. He could not claim ignorance. He could not claim emotional duress. He had literally recorded himself celebrating the very document that was now being
Ну,
used
она в
to
основном
execute his
легенд
financial ruin.
стримит.
His knees visibly buckled,
Ведь не так
and he
важно,
grabbed the
можно
edge of the marble
посидеть и
counter
без
just to keep
алка
himself
и
from collapsing
нормально.
onto the floor.
Что-то
I looked
хорошо,
at him,
Ачи,
feeling no
хорошо.
pity, no anger,
Убедил.
and no sorrow. The man I once loved had never
Нормально
existed.
общаться, это
His
можно,
empire was
да, но
entirely
когда
gone.
ты
A
редко
truly
видишь
manipulative family does not surrender
с
simply because
какими-то
one of their
людьми,
own has been
как
defeated.
будто
3
бы
days after Mark was escorted out of my building by
чувствуешь, что
security,
надо,
his
не
older sister,
знаю.
Marlene, attempted a desperate and highly aggressive
Накормлю
counterattack.
Ты
She arrived at Vivian's
обещал
corporate law office
мне?
accompanied by a
То
very
есть ты
loud,
мне
very
обещал,
expensive
что
litigation attorney.
накормишь меня
Marlene sat
брискетом.
across the polished conference table, glaring at me with absolute venom. She had already
Нет, с
begun leaking
паприкой
rumors to our
мы
mutual
вообще
social
не
circles,
знакомы.
claiming that I was a cold,
Но я её
calculating
видела.
tyrant who had engaged in
Красненькая
severe
такая,
financial abuse
рыженькая
against her brother.
девочка. С красным
She was
волосом.
trying to paint Mark as a victim of my controlling nature. My client is prepared to file a massive
Можно и
lawsuit
без
against you.
пить занырнуть в него
Marlene's attorney
коллективно.
barked,
И она,
leaning
по-моему,
aggressively
кстати,
over the table.
портосик, она
You
не с-
illegally
она
evicted
с
your
Москвы,
husband,
она не
froze
из
his access to
Питера.
marital funds, and left him
Я из
destitute.
Питера.
We will demand the immediate invalidation of your post-nuptial agreement and seek massive punitive damages for the emotional
сожалению,
distress you have inflicted
получается.
upon him. I did not raise my voice.
Ну а чё,
I did not
получается,
defend my
ты
character.
лишишь меня
I simply looked at Vivian and nodded.
девственности.
Vivian
Я
opened a
никогда
single
не
red
ела
folder and slid it
брискет.
smoothly across the mahogany table toward Marlene. Before you file any public grievances regarding financial abuse, Vivian said calmly, I strongly suggest you review pages 4 through 9 of this forensic audit. Marlene snatched the folder, her confident sneer faltering as she read the highlighted text. The pages
Блин, я,
documented the
получается,
dozens of
чё-то
unauthorized wire
релс?
transfers Mark had funneled from my corporate account directly
Я
into
уже 2
Marlene's fake
года не
consulting shell
выпивала,
company.
и нет такого
The
чувства,
transactions
даже
totaled tens of
когда
thousands of
видимся с
dollars.
людьми раз в полгода,
If you
нормально
attempt to
так
file a
общаемся.
lawsuit to open my
Это,
client's financial
кстати,
records to a
знаешь, как
judge,
с кофеином,
Vivian
как
continued,
будто бы.
her tone dropping to a dangerous
Типа,
whisper,
чем чаще ты пьешь
will be
кофе,
forced to submit
тем
this
чаще
audit as
тебе
evidence.
хочется кофе.
the authorities will immediately
Вот
trace
так
the
же с
stolen funds to your
алкоголем,
corporate
если
accounts.
ты привык
You will
пить
be
в
indicted as a
компании,
willing
то тебе
co-conspirator in
именно
a massive
будет
fraud and
хотеться
embezzlement scheme.
выпить.
Marlene's expensive attorney leaned over, reading the
В
document.
смысле
He immediately
получается?
closed his briefcase and stepped back from the
Ну,
table,
на стриме
recognizing
не
a toxic,
считается.
unwinnable
На
case.
стриме это...
Marlene turned a sickly shade of white. She looked at the
Это
undeniable
знаешь,
proof of her
это
own
если бы я
criminal complicity.
приходила...
She realized that trying to save her brother would guarantee her own destruction.
Сейчас.
Without saying another word,
Я
Marlene stood up,
подумаю.
abandoned her
Если я
attorney,
приходила
and
на
practically
стрим,
ran out of the
запускала
conference room.
стрим для того,
never
чтобы
contacted Mark
пожрать
again.
в кафешке.
when he desperately needed his family's immense
так я иду
resources to
в
survive.
кафешку, чтобы
His sister chose to protect her own bank accounts and
заполнить
completely severed
эфир
all ties with
стрима,
him.
что ли.
She left him to
Вот
drown.
так.
The justice system moves slowly,
На
but when it
схватке,
finally arrives,
честно
its weight
говоря,
is
я не
absolutely
ем
crushing.
больше,
Over the
чем
next 6
не
months,
могу за
Mark's
себя
reality
заплатить.
deteriorated into an inescapable nightmare.
То есть
stripped
я
of my
никогда
income,
не рассчитывала на
abandoned
то,
by his
что
wealthy
за
sister,
меня заплатят.
and blacklisted by his
В
former
итоге.
social circle after the truth of his fake
Но вы
venture
потом
capitalist
сами
persona
такие,
leaked out.
«Маша,
He was left with absolutely nothing. He
Я
initially
такая, ничего не
attempted to evade the
отказываю, что ли?»
$250,000 civil judgment by consulting bankruptcy attorneys. He assumed he could simply file
Я
Chapter
каждый день
7,
выпиваю 2
wipe the slate clean,
капучино и не
and start
больше.
over
Уже,
with a new
наверное,
but the law is
лет так
highly
5.
specific regarding the nature of
2
debts,
капучино. Ну, это
because the
всё равно
liabilities he
нормально.
incurred were
Я
directly tied to
люблю
documented fraud,
какой-нибудь,
intentional
знаете,
property
холодный
damage,
раф или
and the
айс
theft of
латте,
Walter
вот
and Cora's
0,5
identities.
сразу
A federal
взять и
judge
ходить
strictly ruled that the
подсасывать
debt was
там
non-dischargeable.
полдня.
He was
Вообще,
permanently chained to
как
his financial crimes.
дальнобойщик.
Furthermore, the forensic audit Vivian submitted to the authorities triggered an immediate investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. Mark had spent years funneling stolen money and hiding his fake consulting fees without ever filing a legitimate tax return. The IRS moved with terrifying efficiency, levying massive penalties for tax evasion and fraudulent income reporting. To survive and comply with his court-ordered restitution payments, Mark was forced to take the only employment available to a man with a ruined background and a pending criminal record. He secured a minimum wage job working the
Ладно,
overnight
что
sanitation
грустно.
shift at a large commercial warehouse in the
Правда,
industrial
давно уж не
district.
провод
My private
тяжело
investigator
найти.
sent me one final,
Наверное, потому
unsolicited
что
photograph
в
to close
Питере
the
вообще
file.
на
It
каждом
was taken at 3 in the
шагу
morning.
разные
Mark was wearing a
кофейни,
stained gray
типа.
uniform,
И здесь
pushing a
нет
heavy yellow mop
рафа
bucket across
с
a concrete
кленовым
floor under flickering
сиропом,
fluorescent lights.
то в другом
Resting on the
месте
handle of his
точно
cleaning cart was a
найдется.
thick, official
И
envelope bearing the
бамбл
unmistakable seal of the
свежевыжатый.
IRS. The man who used to wear Italian silk and drink premium bourbon while insulting my
Один
career
выпивает
was
0,5
now
в
spending
год.
his nights scrubbing dirt,
Ну,
opening tax
главное,
notices
что
he could
доволен
never
был.
possibly pay. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own meticulous design, isolated
Остальное
from the
меня не
world,
забудет.
and stripped of the
И по
arrogance that had
кнопкам
defined his
падал.
entire existence. The numbers never truly forget. He had spent his entire adult life believing that consequences were meant for other people, that his charm and his aggressive manipulation could shield him from
Хреново
reality.
даже не
But reality had arrived in the form of relentless, unyielding paperwork, and it
извиняюсь.
demanded repayment for every single lie he had ever told. The universe had finally balanced its heavy scales. Healing is not a sudden, magical event. It is a quiet, gradual process of reclaiming the spaces in your life that were once filled with anxiety and dread. 3 months after the divorce was
О,
finalized,
открыл
I
мне
purchased a beautiful,
неожиданно.
single-story wooden
Неожиданно
house nestled on the
вообще.
serene shores of Lake
Спасибо,
Washington.
Топтун.
I moved Walter and Cora out of their old neighborhood
Я
and settled
поняла,
them
вам
into this
просто
peaceful sanctuary,
нравится, когда вас
complete with a private nursing
унижают, когда
caregiver
вас
to assist them.
подъёбывают.
The transformation in my parents was remarkable.
Вот, когда на
Without
вас
Mark constantly
каблучком
hovering around them,
наступает, тогда
playing the
вы
manipulative,
сразу
devoted
активизируетесь.
son-in-law while secretly plotting to drain their resources. The tension in their
Понятно,
home
буду
vanished
знать.
completely. One Sunday afternoon, while we were sitting on the back deck watching the sailboats glide across the
Так,
blue
мы
water,
после этого
my mother handed
трека
me a
забала
small,
канала.
folded piece of paper.
Сейчас вот его
It was a handwritten
дослушаем
letter.
и тут поставим.
I opened it and read her
Спасибо
elegant
большое,
script.
очень приятно.
She apologized, deeply and sincerely, forever
Про
doubting
меня
my judgment.
помнишь, про меня
She
не
apologized
забывай.
for telling me to endure the hardships, admitting that she had been completely blinded by his theatrical kindness. I held her hand and told her that there was nothing
Кленовый
left to
даже не
forgive.
провод. Блядь,
We
дай
had
бог,
survived the storm together,
найдут
The
кокосовое
most beautiful
молоко.
transformation, however, belonged to Buster.
Европа.
During my marriage, my golden retriever had
Спасибо,
developed a
конечно,
severe anxiety
спасибо.
response to the sound of the penthouse elevator dinging. He knew that sound
Переигрывать
meant Mark was coming home, usually carrying a dark, volatile mood that would inevitably lead to shouting. Buster
Мне
used to
как-то
hide under the
поляк
guest
предложил
bed for
сбегать в
hours.
супермаркет,
Now,
купить
lying on the
кокосовое,
sun-warmed
тогда
cedar
он не
planks of the
идет.
deck. Buster was a completely different
Серьезно?
animal. He spent his days chasing tennis balls in the
Нет,
wide
на
green
самом
yard and sleeping
деле,
deeply at my feet while
я
I
вообще
worked on
не
my laptop.
против была бы
He no longer
сбегать.
flinched at sudden noises.
Не потому что я
He no
типа на
longer anticipated
побегушках,
cruelty.
потому что
Watching my mother laugh at something my father said,
типа чел
while my
не
dog
просто
snored peacefully
сказал,
in the
а
afternoon
он
sun,
придумал
I felt a
альтернативу.
profound sense of absolute victory.
То есть для
I had
меня
not
это
just
скорее
defeated a predator,
плюс.
I had
Я не
successfully
против,
shielded the
знаете,
people I loved most
если
from
нет
his toxic
какого-то
reach. The air in
цвета
our lives was
у
finally clean.
маникюрщицы,
We were finally
а я
completely
хочу
safe.
вот определенный
When you
цвет или
spend years
определенную
managing corporate
стирку
strategy
для
and mitigating
ногтей,
massive financial
то я
risks
не
for an
против ее
international firm,
купить.
you learn how to
Типа,
build
ну, я
indestructible
подарю
systems.
ее,
But it was
естественно,
only
потому
after dismantling Mark's
что
entire parasitic
мне она
existence
нахрен не
that I
нужна
realized my
больше.
true professional calling.
Вот, но
I did not
это
want to spend
будет
the rest of my
именно то,
life
что
simply
человек
increasing
пошел
profit margins
мне
for faceless corporate boards. I wanted to use my specific, hard-earned knowledge to empower others. 6 months after my legal victory, I officially resigned from my corporate director position. I utilized
Я
the
вообще
capital I had fiercely protected in my private
чувствительная,
LLC to launch my own independent financial consulting firm in downtown Seattle. My firm did not cater to standard corporate clients or wealthy venture capitalists. My entire business model was dedicated exclusively to women navigating high net worth divorces and complex financial abuse scenarios. I hired a team of elite forensic accountants, fierce legal consultants, and cybersecurity experts. We specialized in tracking hidden assets, exposing fraudulent debt, and building impenetrable financial boundaries for women who were being manipulated by their partners. My office was a beautiful, sunlit space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Puget Sound. It was a stark contrast to the dark, tense environments I had endured for 4 years. Women would walk into my office trembling, completely overwhelmed by husbands who controlled their bank accounts and threatened to leave them with nothing. I would sit across the table from them, hand them a cup of warm tea, and look them directly in the eyes. I would tell them exactly how we were going to trace every single dollar, lock down their credit, and execute a flawless, silent separation. I watched their terror slowly transform into empowered, cold determination. I was no longer just a survivor of a narcissistic manipulator. I was actively designing the blueprints to dismantle dozens of them. I was turning my darkest, most exhausting years into a highly profitable, deeply meaningful empire. Every time we secured a victory for a client, freezing an abusive husband out of an account he thought he controlled, I felt a quiet surge of absolute satisfaction. I had taken back the pen and rewritten my own destiny. I owned my entire life. People often romanticize the concept of freedom. They imagine it as a dramatic, cinematic moment, a tearful confrontation in the pouring rain, a screaming match where you finally tell your abuser exactly how much they hurt you, or a dramatic exit with suitcases thrown into the back of a waiting taxi. But true, lasting freedom does not arrive like a thunderclap. It is entirely unglamorous. It is incredibly quiet. Freedom arrived for me in the form of a biometric lock being installed on a heavy oak door. It arrived in the sterile, air-conditioned office of a forensic accountant, printing out columns of undeniable debt. It arrived in the crisp, legal language of an irrevocable trust document, and in the polite, professional voice of a bank representative confirming that a credit line had been permanently frozen. Mark used to stand in the center of my expensive penthouse, drinking liquor bought with my money, and sneer at me. He used to say, "You are so lucky I stay with you. Without me, you would just be a lonely, boring corporate drone." For years, I believed that toxic lie. I believed my worth was somehow tied to his presence. But as I sit here now, looking out over the calm waters of the lake, completely unburdened by his chaos, I know the absolute truth. I was never the lucky one in that equation. He was lucky that I let him stay as long as I did, and he was incredibly foolish to mistake my patience for weakness. The best revenge is not destroying someone else's life. The best revenge is becoming so undeniably successful, so legally protected, and so financially untouchable that your abuser becomes nothing more than a footnote in your history. If you are currently sitting in the dark, wondering how you will ever escape a person who is draining your life and your resources, remember this. Do not scream. Do not argue. Document everything. Build your fortress in absolute silence. Because freedom isn't just walking away. It is locking the door permanently behind you. If you believe that the best revenge is unshakable success and ironclad paperwork, share this story. Stay strong and protect your peace. The heavy door clicked shut,